So welcome everyone to the Funding Impact Measurement Working Group meeting for CHAOSS. We are, as always, under the CHAOSS Code of Conduct, so keep that in mind and please be kind to each other. We have an interesting agenda. So we have, as part of our speaker series, Stuart and Sarah Ann are going to present some research on OSS funding and OSSF security scorecard scores. So I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's really going to be interesting, and it's the main part of our agenda. So I think with that, I can just turn it over to Stuart and Sarah Ann, and I think you should be able to just share your screen if you have materials. Let me know if you have any issues.
We'll do, and we'll share over the deck afterwards too for folks. But yeah, good to meet everybody, or re-meet some of you. I'm Stu Scott, work at the Atlantic Council with our cybersecurity policy team, and get to work with Sarah Ann. Do you want to say hey while I find slides?
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Ann. I work with Stu at the Atlantic Council. Also, really excited to see all of you.
Awesome. Oh no, this is the wrong screen. Here, we'll go with that. Can you all see the slides fine on that?
I do not see any slides yet.
Oop. All right. Try that again. There we go. That working? Awesome.
Perfect.
So we're going to talk through a couple of research projects. And Sarah Ann and I worked on these with our team and John Speed Myers from ChainGuard, who's a senior fellow with us. So a quick outline is that there are three projects. We're going to talk about two of them. One of them is out and exists in the world.
Stu, I think you might be sharing the PowerPoint slide and not the presented mode.
Here, is that working?
Yes.
All right, we'll just go with that. So the first is the Oh Money Money report, a nice little fun title. And then the second, which we're currently working on, is the Buying Security report. There's a third report. I'm not going to talk about much, if at all, but where the first two look at funding impact on security practices, the third looks at the funding landscape itself, what exists, what doesn't. So nice kind of complementary and well-timed by accident. But for those of you wondering why a think tank is looking at open source software security, we had spun up a lot of work on software supply chain security that spun off into OSS security work, and kept running into a similar problem of there not being much empirical data really about anything in our field. But we wanted to try and contribute to developing that part of the research a bit more. And so the initial prompt was, we had talked to policymakers a lot about funding projects, given the kind of surfeit of, many funding initiatives, plenty from nonprofits, trade associations, from philanthropy. And I'm sure you guys are familiar with most of these, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But also from governments, either existing funding programs or expressions of intent to try to fund open source software, and also a lot of industry. So GitHub, FOSS funds modeled off that initial Indeed FOSS fund model, and also a newer model, the Open Source Software Pledge. But a implicit assumption underlying a lot of the policy conversations was that, if you fund a project, that project is better. It's more secure. It's got a healthier community. And as I mentioned, there wasn't a lot of empirical data on our side. So we started with kind of a naive version of the question. Can you buy security for open source software projects? This is not a particularly interesting question. The answer is yes. As early as 2006, DHS subsidized a vulnerability scanner for a bunch of projects that I'd identified. They used it, they found some vulnerabilities, and they fixed them. And you see similar work with Alpha Omega, with OSTIF, and even Tidelift ran kind of a pilot program where they paid some projects to improve their scorecard scores. So the more interesting question we wanted to test out was whether projects with broad financial support, so not explicitly, hey, here's some money, go improve security, were going to be more secure than similar unfunded projects. And this was kind of the framework we started that initial Oh Money Money report under. So the first few steps, just for context here too, I'm going to do a lot of the talking, but Sarah Ann has done like the vast majority of the work here. So major kudos to her. But these are the kind of 4 terms we needed to figure out. And so we chose for general projects, 2 language ecosystems, PyPI and NPM, and just took the 1,000 most popular projects from each with a GitHub repo. And for broad financial support, John Speed and one of his colleagues had developed a tool called Funder Finder that would scan GitHub repo and look for associations with some of the most common funding platforms and programs. GitHub sponsors, Open Collective, Tidelift, and then there were 2 others. We just didn't include them because there wasn't a significant sample size. Following that, we had to define more secure. Instead of trying to solve the problem of measuring security outcomes, we went with security practices. So as you guys know, OpenSSF has this scorecard tool, measures a bunch of different factors and characteristics about a GitHub repo and produces both scores for each of those, and then one overall score through a somewhat confusing weighting system. But gives you a nice granular look at specific practices, and it's relatively easy to kind of understand and has a really large public data set associated with it. And then finally, when we were comparing to unfunded projects, we needed to have some kind of similarity between the two. So by going with the most downloaded projects, there was a similar kind of visibility of projects. And we didn't have to worry about, is the project serving a similar function in a funded context as in an unfunded context. So this is like the kind of first metal detector test. Is there some kind of correlation here between funding and security practices worth investigating farther? And just some methodology details here. Funder Finder looks at, when we ran the study, these 5, they might have added another funding program to that actually. And as I'm sure you guys are familiar with, scorecards, all good things can be measured on a scale of 1 to 10. And here are some of the subchecks as well. So with that in mind, we broke out our sample into 2 language ecosystems and then the number of funding instances among them. So anything in green, large enough sample that we're sure there's going to be some statistical significance possible. Yellow, a little borderline, and then the red ones, NumFocus and Google Summer Code, just didn't have enough projects associated with them for us to measure with good fidelity. And so then we did a pretty straightforward correlation test. So looked at the scorecard scores, compared them to instances with no funding, and then did some t-tests to make sure that they were statistically significant differences. These are the overall scorecard scores. So for PyPI, it was a small difference, but it was really robust. Funding of any kind, and then the specific funders demonstrated a slightly higher scorecard score. NPM was a little different. While there were 2 very similar funding programs causing or leading to a correlation with an increased scorecard score, some of them just didn't have a difference. And John Speed had done some work looking at the differences between the PyPI sample and the NPM sample. And part of his explanation was a lot of the NPM packages are smaller. They're not necessarily particularly active. This doesn't mean they're good or bad. They're just like a different ecosystem. And so you're looking at some of that reflected in the data. So here's just a summary table. And for context, and Sarah, and if you want to chime in with some of the details, there's GitHub sponsors can be affiliated with either like an organizational or individual giving pattern. And so the organizational one tended to hit a little bit above its weight. Go ahead.
And yeah, just chiming on that also, like some of these are kind of like decisions we had to make about like what to count here. So in GitHub individual, we want the same pattern that the Funder Finder practice uses, which is to look at if some of the, it's like some number, I think it's 3 to 5 of the top maintainers on a project are receiving money through GitHub sponsors individually, and then organizational is money going directly to the project. So it kind of makes intuitive sense that that has a difference in terms of how much it's focused on the project or how much it might be distributed across other projects. But those are kind of, methodology decisions that kind of are a little bit, you could quibble with about like where exactly that cutoff is of how many people or of how you want to count that. But
another good example of that is you can actually like link your GitHub sponsors account to an Open Collective instance. So that's part of the merit in breaking those apart and not just doing any funding is to avoid either undercounting or overcounting. But After looking at the kind of overall scores, we dove into some of the subchecks. These are just the ones that were kind of most interesting throughout the data set, and we'll dive into some of the differences here. But these generally demonstrated a significant difference and were largely driving that delta in overall score difference. So if you look at the numbers for Python, for example, green here means not only is it a larger score when there's funding than when there isn't funding, but it's statistically significant. So if it's not green, but it's a big number, it doesn't mean much. But you'll see here, for example, contributors and CI testing. These generally were higher scores. You'll see here, very interestingly, whether the project is actively maintained, it's getting commits, I think at least one every 2 or 3 weeks. Was a massive difference across funded and unfunded projects. You'll see some smaller ones that aren't across the board differentiated. But yeah, and it's important to note here, in general, these funding streams are largely kind of without condition. The exception here is Tidelift, which does have some conditions on whether a project can receive that kind of a monthly stipend. One of those differences is security policy. So that is largely responsible for the big delta here. And the reason it's not even larger is that the way Scorecard checks it is for like a very specific title format. So you can have a policy, and if you call it security policy MD, then you don't get credit for that. And so switching to the NPM ecosystem, again, we see some kind of more nuanced findings. The branch protection, for example, is on average worse. We're not really sure why. Likely these are not necessarily as complex projects, so they don't need kind of as much security apparatus around them. But again, we see similar contributors as a factor here. Is again marginally better for funded projects. Mitigation of dangerous workflows is similarly. And then interestingly, dependency update tools was a very mixed bag. We didn't really know what to make of that. But again, here, security policy, and again, Tidelift with a pretty significant delta above even the differentiated ones. So here are just a quick summary tables of the specific subchecks across both ecosystems. And so we got to the end of that project. We're pretty happy with, there's reason to suspect that there's some relationship between funding and security practices as measured by security scorecards, but there are a lot of problems with the research. It's kind of a first step. First of all, it's rampant opportunity for selection bias, right? These are popular projects. They're going to have more visibility. They're going to have more kind of engagement with the kind of mainstay organizations in the open source software ecosystem. They might not be representative of the larger ecosystem. We also don't really know if there's a strong connection between security practices as measured by scorecards, actual security practices, and security outcomes. We're not looking at the amount of funding here. We're not looking at any kind of causal ordering. The scorecard tool itself can be a little wonky. So it changes over time, and therefore the scores do, even if the project underlying it remains the same. There's some debates around whether the checks and the subchecks are particularly comprehensive. For example, fuzzing only looks at a couple of fuzzing tools. If you have one that's not there, no credit. But the big one here, the big limitation that we wanted to move past is this is just correlation, right? You could make a very reasonable argument that a more mature project is more likely to have a good scorecard score. And because of that, they're more likely to attract funding. So we might even be finding kind of the opposite here. So that led us to our next project, which we're currently working on, where we want to identify some kind of causal relationship or the absence thereof. And so our approach for this is we're not even going to try A/B testing. Too hard to find projects that are identical in kind of context, their function. Instead, we're going to look at time series analysis. And so here it's a pretty straightforward methodology again, but it gets much more interesting when we start looking at causal mechanisms, start diving into some results. But the basic approach is we're going to take public funding data from Open Collective over time. We're going to take the historical scorecard data, and we're going to look at them on the same x-axis. We went with 1 month to try and capture regular monthly donations instead of the kind of 2-week scans that scorecards run. And we're going to do some modeling and ramp up the kind of complexity as we go. We're also talking to GitHub, and they've kindly agreed to share some of their sponsors' data. So we'll have a second set with a much larger sample size, looking at, again, funding over time and scorecard scores over time. So here is the basic process for that. You find an open collective account, you associate it with an underlying GitHub repo where possible, and you're able to pull out transaction logs, find the funding amount over time, bucket that into a month, and move on to the scorecard scores. And so you can get these going back, I think, to 2022, correct, Saran?
It's about September 2021 with some month gaps, but OpenSSF maintains a BigQuery data set, which is fantastic and has kind of like these cached scores for a bunch of different projects. So there's a lot of overlap between the projects that are stored and have open collective pages and then are stored in the OpenSSF data set. So that's another limitation, is we can only see the scores for those projects right now.
And so there's also some really interesting demographic data Saran's been able to find here. It's not particularly surprising, but for example, most projects don't have that much funding and a few have a lot of funding. This is kind of the very zoomed out version with one outlier. And then when you get a little closer in, you see the emergence of what looks like a bit of power law. You can also find the distribution of scorecard scores looks relatively normal with a bit of like a stegosaurus pattern going on, suggesting that some of the subchecks are adding at regular and common intervals. But we're also going to look at the subchecks flagged by the correlation study. So these are our kind of top three where there is indication of really, really strong correlations between funding and scorecard scores. But on to my favorite part, our methodology here. How do you do this kind of analysis? So the first step we want to do is what's called Granger causality. It's great for when you don't have like a clear causal model. It's kind of tailor-made for your first pass at time series analysis. And the basic framework is does funding at time t predict a change in scorecard score after a certain amount of lag time? It'll help you identify that lag time. And it'll also do a great job at making sure that lag time is like correctly ordered. So you can make the strong argument that a scorecard score is indicative of some kind of characteristics about a project that are likely to incur funding. This will not conflate the two, but it does have drawbacks. Number one, you don't really have a clean way of modeling in confounding variables. So where something affects both scorecard score and funding. And number two is this is predictive causality, right? So this is saying, hey, here's the funding number. Does that predict a change in a scorecard number? Not does it mechanically cause a change in a scorecard number? So again, it's like a metal detector test. There's something here. If that is the case, we can dig a little deeper. The other thing to note is it's much, much better at binary treatments than continuous treatments. So, say something happens in a month and you want to see what effect that has on your dependent variable. Very good at that. It's still decent at continuous data, but just not quite as robust. So we've already done the kind of preliminary analysis here. And you have examples of kind of all three cases here. You have examples of Granger causality between funding and scorecard score changes. So here is a radar R, big spike in funding, followed by a lag time. And Sarah, remind me, it was about 3-month lag time?
Yeah, I think up to about 3 for this one.
Green money goes up, blue scorecard goes up. This is cool. But you also have some rejected hypotheses where the numbers are just kind of all over the place. And interestingly, you can also find some examples of projects where the reverse is true. You end up with a scorecard going up, predicting in a statistically significant way funding going up. So one step we'll take from this is looking at the set of projects where there was causality in one direction and causality in the other direction, Granger causality. What are some common characteristics of these projects? Are they from the same language ecosystem? Are they similar popularity? Are they of similar age? Do they have similar amounts of commit activity? And you can actually build that into a Granger test with some confounding variables. But we also want to take a look at mechanical causality, causal inference. And to do that, we need some kind of model to test against. So this is what we're sketching together now. And our main goal here is to identify where there are factors about a project that reasonably should affect both funding and scorecard scores. And you're able to model that in and basically control for those. So our kind of quick sketch of that is three confounders: project age, project popularity, and commit activity. And the basic reasoning here is for project age, older a project is, more time it has to attract funding, to seek funding, and also the more time it has to, notionally change, ideally improve its scorecard score. We also expect project age to have some kind of effect on project popularity, right? It's hard to be popular without having been around for a while. For project popularity, we would expect, again, a popular project has more visibility. A larger community is more able to pull in funding, more likely to have, kind of contributors and users, casually giving money through the sponsors program, through Open Collective. We also expect that there's a more chance it is either aware of or made aware of scorecards. More chance that scorecards, talk to them, that they want to improve that. And then finally, for commit activity, this one is pretty straightforward. The more active a project is, the more likely it's able to, either through its maintainers or contributors, get funding. And the more the code base changes, the more likely the scorecard score is to change. So this is kind of our model, and we'll pull together what kind of exact statistical testing we want to do on this. But I think the interesting part here, and then happy to take folks' questions, is, you can imagine a world where we find that there is like no causal relationship between funding, general funding, and scorecard changes. And you can imagine a world where the opposite is true, where there's a strong relationship. I think in either case, though, from a policy angle, you can start making really specific recommendations based on that, particularly to governments that are interested in either supporting the open source ecosystem holistically or very specifically interested in security. In one world, general funding is insufficient. If you have a goal in mind, you need to work toward that goal specifically. But in another model, if cash leads to security and you don't need much kind of framework around that, that's a much cleaner way of engaging with the open source ecosystem. So I appreciate you all bearing with me running through that a bit, but very much welcome questions, particularly on the latter half, as this is still a work in progress. So if you guys have good insight, we can directly use that to inform the work.
Questions?
Go for it.
I'm going to jump right in here, and just for sake of full disclosure, this is also, I'll say that Stuart and Sarah, and that this is a research project that we're commissioning through the Sovereign Tech Agency, so I'm really, really pleased to see this coming together. I had a question about your causal model, and particularly the confounders, and I was wondering the extent to which you'd considered other sources of funding as a possible confounder and how you were controlling for that, if at all.
It's a great question. I think it's going to vary between the GitHub sponsors data and the Open Collective data, because Open Collective data acting more like a platform for multiple sources of funding. So for each transaction, we can see where those are coming from. It would involve a little bit of script tricks, but it would be relatively straightforward to tease out kind of small person to project donations from institutional ones. The GitHub sponsors data, I think, is going to be a little trickier on that front. We might rerun Funder Finder, for example, and see if we can find concurrent instances there. But I think the other like useful note here is separate, and different from the correlation study. We don't have to condition this on the general funding model. So one thing that the Open Collective data lets us do is look at thresholds, so the amount of funding, and where there are, kind of clear institutional gifts, in the tens of thousands in single transactions. We can just go look at where those institutions are, whether they're conditioning that funding on anything. So it's investigatable. It's just going to be a little less systemic than the straightforward kind of statistical question.
Just a cheeky follow-up question. I may have missed it, but what's the final sample size that you're dealing with? Population?
Sarah, you would know the Open Collective number at the top of your head.
So on Open Collective, we have about 1,000 collectives that we're looking at. I think it's kind of clear from the power law distribution that there's a subset of those that are going to be a lot more useful to us to get more granular about the score information. And I think it'll be about roughly half of those that we can get some sort of insight from. But then some of the numbers also get fuzzy in that a lot of the collectives have multiple repos or multiple kind of like GitHub projects, and we aren't 100% sure about how we're going to like count those. And so right now we've just maximally like included a lot of those and looked at a lot of those on scorecards, but that might be kind of unfair to some projects where it's like maybe they have an extra repo that's like sample code or something where they don't want that to be kind of like considered the core. And we're going to try to figure out how to include that within all the subject information when we decide if we want to, average across a project or look at each of those individually and things like that.
And on the GitHub sponsors front, their data, it'll basically be, pick your N of projects. The condition on that is to not, expose their like transaction data, which is going to be, 2 people. They're going to run and send back to us the results anonymized by project. So we'll have a very like controllable sample size. We just won't have visibility into specific projects.
Awesome, thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Kaylin.
Hey, yeah, thank you so much for sharing findings from your ongoing work. I thought I was quite curious when you showed the cases of confirmed hypotheses like radar R and rejected hypotheses. I was wondering if you could go to one of the slides you showed on the rejected hypotheses.
Yeah.
Where, I'm just going through the notes, where I think funding goes up, but scores go down. And I was wondering if you looked into some of those examples on a case-by-case basis and have any thoughts or hypotheses on why that's the case.
Yeah, it's a great question. We haven't gone in yet, but one interesting facet of the scorecard scores is across the entire data set, you can see some months where there's a kind of universal change of a similar magnitude. So I think actually, yeah, July-ish of 23. A lot of the times, like the scorecard rubric will change, and so all projects will have some kind of change reflected into that, which could be a possibility. The other possibility here is that there's just no relationship between the two, and so this runs up against some of the limitations of the scorecard tool as a dependent variable. It might be the case that the maintainers have received explicit money to like improve their project security, and they're just fixing vulnerabilities. That won't necessarily show up at all in the scorecard tool. So I think, and Sarah Ann would know better than me. I believe Activity Watch is just a kind of null finding, like nothing is predicting one way or the other what's going on. But yeah, it will be like fun and hopefully not too onerous to like look at what the strongest cases are, what the strongest cases against are, and see if we can parcel apart like what the story is.
Stu said it exactly, but also just adding that this is part of why we're going to look into some of the subjects, because when Scorecard makes changes to some of the tooling to look at individual subjects, like maybe they update it to see like consider an additional fuzzing tool, and then all the fuzzing scores spike in the same week or something like that. Like that's the kind of thing that we want to try to pull out as distinct from like the effect on the overall scores to see if we can kind of like go in and look at some of the different subjects to see if there are changes there. Because some of the individual subjects are kind of more consistent in like the methodology for I think the maintained subject looks at, commit activity over 90 days before, and then a couple other details like that. And so if that's really consistent, then we might just look at that subject in more detail and with things like that. And so that's part of why we're trying to get more granular about the subjects.
Amazing, thank you.
Kevin, you've got a question?
Yes, and I really good presentation, and I apologize. I had to step out for a moment, so if during the presentation, so if this is something that you addressed in the presentation, and I apologize if I'm repeating it, but
Don't worry about
it. For the funding component, are you just looking in general at the funding that's being given to the project, or are you exploring kind of what that funding was spent on or what it was targeted for? I mean, is this funding that was specifically used to for security activities, or is this general funding that maybe could be attached to like an event or?
Exactly. Yeah. So this is one of the benefits of the open collective data. Not only do we see the kind of transactions and the amount of money, but we see the origin. So we can investigate that for open collective, and the kind of one of the easiest proxies for whether to look closely at who is giving the money and therefore like under what conditions, if any, is the like size and basically the roundness of the number. So like if you find a $25,000 gift, there's a very good chance that that's coming from, either a software foundation, maybe a firm. And you can look then at under what program and therefore like what conditions. And with GitHub sponsors data, this is a little trickier because we wouldn't have access to like the exact transactions. But it's like, I think in general going to be less likely to have those kind of institutional gifts, but not necessarily like out of the question through GitHub sponsors. And that, again, there's some like fuzzy overlap with Open Collective and GitHub sponsors where like you can integrate those two. So some of the Open Collective data does have GitHub sponsors transactions. I think actually Sarah had an example of that one thrown up.
Yeah, so some of it has GitHub sponsors, and then Open Collective also has it takes the transaction log has money going in and money going out. But we're focusing on money coming in this primarily. So we're looking at the amount of money that's coming in per month, because just anecdotally looking at a lot of the collectives, there's like a lot of lag time and kind of inconsistency in accounting for like paying out. Like maybe you're paying maintainers quarterly, or you're doing different kind of like expense tracking on a yearly basis and those kinds of things. So we thought it was more consistent with the way that funding was coming in to focus on a monthly basis how much money comes in, especially since that's kind of the model of GitHub sponsors and a couple of these other kind of tools. But again, like Stu said, some of the like big institutional funding in the tens of thousands, we're interested in kind of trying to dive deeper into that and to look at those effects, because if those are coming in on a different basis, then it might affect how we want to model that.
The other thing I'll add too, and this is insight from the third project, the Maps and Gaps project, there's in general just not that much security specific funding. So we won't be able to see also like what, if Meta gives, say, MapLibre, I think $150,000 is their like regular increment. We don't know what MapLibre uses that for, but there are going to be relatively few instances where, say, like Alpha Omega gives you money to go, purchase your favorite fuzzer or something like that. Just based on like the relative paucity of security specific funding relative to general funding going on.
Paul.
Maybe one quick question, and I appreciate Stuart and Sarah, and that you're in the midst of this, so don't want to preempt too much, but I find the method incredibly exciting, and being able to demonstrate causality in this space is like super exciting and fascinating. And I was wondering, even though this might be a bit premature, have you thought about ways in which you could sort of extend this research or even apply the methodology in different sort of use cases or instances, or with different measurements ultimately?
It's a great question. We have a separate work stream. It's not open source specific, but it's around cybersecurity metrics. So for context, the U.S. National Cybersecurity Strategy, its author is the Office of the National Cyber Director. They got kind of challenged on this question, right? Like, hey, like what outcomes can you measure that will show that this is working or not? And they said the outcomes do not exist. So from our perspective, we've done a bunch of work around framing how cybersecurity policymakers approach the question of kind of empirical demonstration of progress. And so in this study, like our general kind of interaction with that framework is this is kind of the first step from funding should achieve X, a change in practices or something. Extending that to security outcomes, I think is likely outside of our capabilities, but the similar kind of process of thinking through the causal chain of any kind of security intervention is something we are interested in looking at. An example of this is we're scoping out some work on risk management in energy supply chains, largely not the physical stuff so much, But thinking through things like, country of origin as a proxy for risk, super incomplete, right? Like if I am buying something from a risky vendor but never connecting it to the internet, I really don't care. If I'm buying something and it's coming with communications devices like the recent Reuters reporting, then I do care. So the big picture answer to your question is like in general, yes. We in the policy space, there's a lot of work that's driven by opinion, and candidly, I don't have the confidence to live and die on my opinion alone. I would love to point to a spreadsheet and say, that's where my answer came from. If it's wrong, it's a sample problem. Specifically after this project, I think we'll likely focus more on policy implementation for a bit. But there's some other applications of the larger methodology. Statistics wise, like this is not a particularly sophisticated relative to say academic journals and things like that. But one extension we're interested in is there's a paper working under the supply chain group at North Carolina State University, where they're trying to do one very simple and critical thing relevant to this study, which is get historical scorecard data with a constant version of scorecards. So that would be excellent if we can figure that out and then reapply back. But they're still working on that. So go ahead, George. Is George correct, by the way?
George works. That's the English version. It's German, so pronounced Georg in German. The results seem to indicate that there's no causation from funding to security outcomes. That's kind of what I'm taking away. Yeah, maybe. Okay, and a lot of funding provided right now for open source is to support security. So if I think it's super important that we figure out to show that impact of the funding, because otherwise might we run the risk that the funding dries up if we end up showing that the funding doesn't actually result in what the funding was given for?
It's a great question. I would caveat and say that there's no unconditional relationship between funding and security. I think there are other slides where we show that I think it's around 10% of the sample has some kind of funding then security change by the Granger test. For us, I think the interesting question is what are those conditions? And also what are the results from the causal model where we're controlling for kind of more factors? I think too that I don't know to what degree the proportion of funding being provided is for security purposes specifically versus generally. And so I would come back and say like there are very clear security things that you can fund that have a security benefit. And where you're able to more closely link the objective of the funding with the kind of implementation of it, I think avoid any kind of risk of saying like, hey, you're trying to give money to improve security and it's not working, therefore no money. But can come back and say, this model will work, cash might not work. But I would also say too that the scorecard score as the dependent variable is a really limiting factor here. If I'm giving somebody enough money that they can do this full time, even if that doesn't change the project in a scorecard measurable way, I would say that there's likely a security benefit there, and simply like there is a maintainer who has time to actually maintain the project. So it's something we definitely want to communicate like very clearly, particularly to policymakers who will take any opportunity they can to miss nuance. Where we want to say like, hey, like these factors don't change. That doesn't mean you can't improve security. That doesn't mean the funding doesn't work. But it does mean that like you want to really tailor your interventions. And this is part of the goal of pairing this project and the Maps and Gaps project, is to not only describe the like impacts as we can see them, but also like what the funding landscape is. So like relative to kind of general industry giving, security funding is not that significant of a presence. But it's not always transparent under what conditions projects are funded by FOSS funds. Not always transparent how much developer time from a firm is going to maintain a project in addition to cash. Is that a useful response?
It is. What I'm hearing is you have thought through a lot of the nuances and looking for better ways to explore this space, and this was one of the ways, and it's a step that brings us all forward. And now that we have these results, we can think about new ways to explore this space. So it's really good. Thank you.
It's a great question. Much appreciated.
I also want to acknowledge that the work that you are doing right now, if I go back a couple years, none of the data was even available. None of this would have been possible. So we have come a long way in open source where we can finally explore this.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, thank you so much, Stu and Sarah Ann. This is really interesting. Like Eric said, we didn't have this data a few years ago, and so to see it this way is really fascinating. So thank you so much for your research and for your presentation.
Cheers. Thank you guys for having us, and very much appreciate the questions and the prodding. It's useful for the product.
And you're welcome to join us anytime. So these
Thank you.
meetings are open to anybody. So if you want to just come hang out with us and talk about impact of funding measurements, you're more than welcome.
Cheers.
So we don't have anyone for the research slide series, which is why I just kind of let people continue with questions, because this was the only thing on our agenda. So this was great. Just as a reminder, the research slide series is just a quick 10-minute update on some research. So this could be something you published, something you read from someone else, and it's we have a little template for it, and it's just a really quick presentation. So do we have anybody that wants to do one for the next meeting for June 4th? Anyone want to volunteer? Paul.
I can sneakily do one. It's sort of ongoing research on how we at STA are evaluating our impact, because we're getting closer to trying to put out a sort of evaluation report, and I'd love to get feedback from the community. So yeah, I can give it a go. Cool.
Awesome. Garrick, were you waving at us, or you're waving?
I was waving goodbye to Stuart.
I wasn't sure if you were raising your hand to do a presentation. I have to say, Johan already presented the paper that you and Kevin worked on. So
Yeah.
we've got that one already.
Yeah, we're working on a new research project, but still in very early stages.
Cool. Well, at any point, if you want to come talk to us about it, like Paul said, it doesn't have to be published research. You can talk about what you're doing and get feedback on it too. So that's certainly an option. Okay, cool. So we got one for the 4th. If anyone else, if you think of anything in the meantime, feel free to reach out. You can drop a note in the funding impact working group Slack channel, or message any of us. That's cool too. A couple of reminders. So for anyone going to OSSNA in June in Denver, CHAOSScon is the day after. So we're working on the agenda right now. So we'd welcome people who want to come along. The Open Source Summit is in August in Amsterdam. So hopefully we'll have some interesting CHAOSS talks there as well. UN Open Source Week, I think registration's still open. I'm not 100% sure, but that's the week of the June 16th through the 20th. And I think there should be some interesting stuff there. Paul, I think I read on the socials at some point today that I think the STF is planning on doing some stuff around the UN Open Source Week. Do you want to talk about any of that?
Yeah, happily. So we're full disclosure, we're slightly putting the track in front of us as the train moves along, which is always a good feeling. But we've added a couple of points to the UN Open Source Week program, including a maintainathon. Where we're going to try and bring together, yeah, I know it's a terrible name, but we're going to try and bring together some of the maintainers from some of the core projects that we've worked with, but also some, I think, coming from the kind of Alpha Omega ecosystem, and bring them together, partly to enable a format where people can exchange experiences and talk about kind of commonly shared problems, but also try and use this occasion to put maintenance and critical digital infrastructure in front of policymakers, and sort of increase this understanding of what does it mean to maintain open source software and how important that is for lots of UN related policy goals such as sustainable development and so on. Should be really fun. For those of you who can make it to New York, please do sign up and maybe see you there. That'd be fun. Yes, it is. It's hot fire.
And when is that maintain-a-thon? Is that the early
That will
part?
be on the 16th of June. So yeah, it's a late edition, which is part of the reason why we're kind of bringing this together a bit quickly and haven't been able to publicize it as much as we'd like to, but yeah, it's gonna happen.
I decided that I didn't need to be there for the hackathon, and so I booked travel to come later in the week. And now there are two things that I would like to have gone to on the 16th, and now I'm regretting my choices.
We'll also be doing a side event on the Friday. Program for that is
Okay.
still a bit work in progress, but that will be on kind of. It's a really, you're gonna loathe this framing, and it's a bit cheesy, but it's kind of who maintains the maintainers. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe I can come to that one instead.
Cool.
I look forward to it. That's going to be a fun week.
Yeah, really.
Yes. A long but fun week.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that just extends right into Open Source Summit North America. I'm flying right from New York to Denver, which is part of why I decided not to go for the whole week. Regrets. Okay, the other thing we have here, open source and the European Union on the 11th in Warsaw. I know nothing about this, so maybe somebody else can shed some light on it.
That'll be me. Sorry, but I'll be there as well. Basically, I think on the 10th of June, there is the Open Source Business Alliance, a meeting in Warsaw. And on the 11th, Open Forum Europe are hosting their kind of capital series. And this is to link up with the fact that Poland is taking over the European presidency for this next term. And yeah, again, it will be trying to sort of, put open source in the path of European policymakers and talk about digital sovereignty, the Euro stack, and so on. Yeah, and if anyone's there, do feel free to reach out. I'll be there.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks everybody. This was a really good meeting. We, as I mentioned, have our next one in 2 weeks on June 4th. So I hope to see you then, and I'll see you around in Slack and maybe some other meetings in between. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.